All right, so today's session is about how to prepare for majors. And I would like to give a few disclaimers at the top. Number one is that obviously this does not reflect any of my employer's views. It's just my personal views as a debater. Secondly, I think just generally speaking, there will be a lot of things that you probably knew from beforehand, but I think what's most important is to understand how to prepare for majors in a structured way, which is to say that there may be things that you probably knew about from before. There may be things that you have heard of or have known in one way or the other. But the most important thing is to have a very structured approach to preparing for majors more generally. And given that like the Asian debating scene is the scene in the world that has the most amount of majors, right? We have 4 majors, which like no other place does. Like if you look at Europe, they only have 2 Euros and Worlds. If you look at even Australia, they only have 2 Australs and Worlds. But here we have like 4 majors. We have 2 Asians, ABP and UADC. We have Australs, we have Worlds as well. So I think having a structured approach to prepare for majors, especially when like, you have majors all across the year and throughout the year, I would say that obviously it takes a lot of time. It takes a bit of time to like prepare for majors in general, but having a structured approach to preparing for majors is the most important thing. And that's what I'm going to convey today, or at least try to the best of my extent. So what do we have in terms of content today? We have, firstly, how do you upgrade your debate skills more generally? What's the approach you should take in terms of upgrading your debate skills? Number 2, gathering knowledge on different issues, which we generally know as matter prep. How do you do matter prep? Third, I think, how do you crystallize the matter prep and sort of prepare it into a matter bank? Number 4 and number 5 are some things that are a bit special that I think I generally use, and oftentimes people either know about it but don't do it enough or don't know about it to begin with, is anticipating motions and anticipating what can be the motion in the next major. And number 5, in terms of like a cheat sheet that you can prepare for your debating. And this cheat sheet is not for like, obviously matter bank is something that is different. The cheat sheet is for using in every debate. So I think it's something that is a bit different more generally. So these are the 5 things broadly speaking. I'll have content on the slides, obviously, but do listen to me speaking. If you have any questions that are there on this particular topic, I think there should be a raise hand button here on this particular Zoom, where like if you go to the emoticons, then you can put a raise hand button. If not, just message in the chat if you have any question, or just say that you have a question in the chat and I'll let you unmute yourself and you can sort of ask me the question. Please do ask questions on the specific section that I'm covering. So for example, if I'm covering preparing a matter bank, do make sure that you ask me questions with regards to the matter bank per se in that particular section, right? So I think that's quite important. And then if you have general questions, we can do that in the end if we have some time. So first, honing your debate skills. I'll probably go through this a bit fast, but I think this is something that is quite important. Probably one of the most important things that you can do in terms of preparing for majors. And I think I'll share some of like what I have done over time to sort of, to generally like, prepare for majors overall. I've been doing majors for a long time now. Just did my last majors in July. Done with it for now. But yeah, basically using my experience quite a bit. So there are 2 parts to debate skills. One is self-practice, and the second part is practice. Now, practice obviously involves maybe your teammate, maybe not even your teammate, but your like internal debate club or like your debating community at large. So like country-specific debate communities or university-specific debate communities. I'll go through the self-practice bit because this is where some people generally lag behind and people generally don't do it in a lot of cases. What I generally recommend is trying to give at least 3 PM speeches a week, especially running up to the majors. Say, for example, like 1 or 2 months before majors, trying to do at least 3 PM speeches a week is not a lot to ask for, mostly because this PM speech that you give on different motions from previous majors, motions from previous good like debate tournaments, it can be like something like Malaysia Debate Open, for example, which is a great tournament. Ascension is a great tournament. Oxford IV, Cambridge IV, or any other Sydney Mini, for example. There are like so many debate tournaments across the world that are like very high quality HWS round robin, like, and obviously all the majors across the world. Just try to look at the topics from there and then figure it out. Have a topic and then have 10 minutes of prep. And this is regardless across formats, right? It can be BP, it can be 3v3, 10 minutes of prep. And the reason I've like cut it down to 10 minutes instead of 15 or 30 that you can eventually have in AP is because in AP, you have 3 members and you have 30 minutes of prep, which is pretty much 10 minutes of prep. In BP, which should logically be 7.5 minutes, but still, like, obviously 7.5 minutes is very little time. So just to hit the optimum mark, just have a 10-minute prep and then give a PM speech. The neat part about this is that you record it and you let it go. So for example, you take a topic and maybe the topic selection takes you about 5 minutes. Then you have 10 minutes of prep, that's 15 minutes. Then you give the speech, which is about 7 to 8 minutes, depending on the format that you're prepping for. Obviously, I think all the formats have 7 minutes except Ostros, which is 8 minutes. So then you do 7 to 8 minutes, depending on that. And then you sort of end it right there. It's about 23, 24 minutes. Just end it right there. Do not judge it right away. Maybe half a day later, maybe even a day or two later, like go back at your recorded speech, listen to yourself, and then self-evaluate. I'll tell you why this works in terms of like explaining in terms of, I guess, intuition pump or something like that. The reason this works is because, have you ever had an argument with someone, like not like a debate, an argument with someone more generally, and like 2-3 hours later, you realize, I could have said this in the argument, and maybe then I would have had an upper hand in the argument. That happens to everyone. And that's generally how we operate as human beings. Sometimes you just think of things after that has happened. Sometimes you just think of things after the moment has passed away. So 10 minutes of prep time obviously will give you an avenue to sort of, practice your skills. But later on, half a day later or one day later, oftentimes that realization pops in for you in terms of understanding like, oh, this is something that I could have done better. This is something that I could have done better. Because then you have a bit more time to think about the motion. Maybe at the back of your head, subconsciously, you're thinking about it for a while. Maybe after that, when you're sort of, listening to your speech, you realize, this is something that I could have done better. This is something that I could have done better. Now, the reason I ask you to do it after a bit of a gap is because right away, often you don't realize your mistakes. Obviously, if you realize your mistakes right away, that's amazing. That's great. You take note of them. But oftentimes right away, you do not realize your mistakes. Maybe half a day or one day later, you realize that this is what I should have been, and this is where my potential takes me. What I generally say is, if you get like half a day to prepare for a motion, you usually come up with the best version of the case of a particular case, right? The aim of this particular practice is to reduce that lag time. So the aim of this particular practice is to sort of lessen the gap or sort of close the gap between you as a debater after 15 to 30 minutes of prep versus you as a debater after having half a day to think about that motion. You as a debater who has had half a day to think about a motion is in vast majority of the cases a better debater than you as a debater who has got only 15 to 30 minutes to think about that case. So that's how you slowly keep on upgrading, right? Once you upgrade from this level to the level where you have like half a day, then your half a day level becomes even better, right? That's how you sort of progress as a debater yourself. Now, this is something that's not, I guess, specific to majors, but generally your approach to debating can be better in that sense. The same thing you can do for LO, but I think the exceptional part about LO is in LO, you sort of take a video for this. So it can be like from, I don't know, 2018 Worlds, just randomly saying, maybe 2018 Worlds round 3 or round 4 or something, where you put up that debate, you obviously look at the topic, and then you give an LO speech from the PM speech that happened in that Worlds, and then you sort of give the LO speech after the PM speech that has been given in that Worlds, right? So at that particular point in time, like, you can give an LO speech in response to the PM speech that has happened. Then you can do one of two things. Either you can do the same thing where you can just leave it be, let it be, and then like half a day later, you listen to it and you try to figure out your mistakes. Or you can listen to the LO speech in that video. Usually the good to great rooms are the ones that are recorded. Sometimes the debate is not as great, but even then you look at the difference between that LO and your LO. If you're better, then obviously great. If they're doing something different, then check out what they're doing different and what they're doing better than you. So in this particular instance, it's easier to evaluate your speech because you have a standard to evaluate it against. Sometimes that standard is not particularly great. I recognize that. But in vast majority of the cases, given that the rooms that tend to be recorded are quite good, they are actually good standards to compare it against. So these are the tools of self-practice. And the reason I'm saying this in quite such detail is because I want you to understand this particular way of prepping, which depends on no one but yourself, right? And that is something that is quite important. If you can do enough self-practice before majors, I think you become a significantly better debater. I remember doing a lot of self-practice before my first Worlds. And the reasoning behind this, I think, is something that a lot of Asian debaters can sort of relate to. In my first Worlds that I did, it was in Mexico. And the problem that happened in the Bangladeshi circuit at the time, and debating was completely offline at the time, of course, was that like only one other team from Bangladesh was going to Mexico, and they were from a different city, right? And no other team was going to Mexico because it was just so expensive. Nobody wanted to go to Mexico. It was just like, it was so expensive and their universities wouldn't fund them. So we didn't have many prep tournaments, because usually run up to Worlds, we have some prep tournaments. So what do we do at that particular point in time? Obviously, we did some like intra sort of like debate practice sessions within our club, but even that has its limits. Like, there are people who are not motivated to debate because they're not going to Worlds at that point in time. So in those cases, we had to resort to a lot of self-practice going into our first Worlds. So like, even then we ended up without a lot of actual tournament practice, we still ended up breaking in our first World and making open quarterfinals because we focused a lot on self-practice. So I would recommend, like, putting a lot of your effort into self-practice if you can, and if you can invest the time. Again, as I said, this is like, I'll probably write it here, like 3/4 times a week to avoid burnout. Of course, you don't want to overdo it. I think burnout is a real thing. Don't overdo it. Just do 3 to 4 times a week in the run up to majors, of course. But also in general, if you want to improve, so if you want to improve, then you can do that as well. In terms of practice, I think this one I'll go through very fast because I think all of you are somewhat familiar with this. Host internal and external practice. Host internal and external practice. For this, like, you can go to tournaments, you can do practice without judges if required. Like, you can just self-evaluate each other. Maybe there are two teams, one team can evaluate the other. You don't have to have a winner in a practice debate. I mean, I understand that debaters are generally quite like competitive, but you don't really need to do that at this point in time. So yeah, so like, the one thing that I say about practice in this particular instance, and I think this is something that like Sajid and I did even in local tournaments to a certain extent, which was we used to experiment a lot, not just in practice, but also in local tournaments. And the reason is because in majors, you don't experiment. In majors, you know your strengths, you know your weaknesses, you play according to your strengths and weaknesses, you know what your partner needs to do, you know what you need to do, you just do it there. In local tournaments and in practice sessions, do experiment a lot. If you think you are struggling with framing, make sure that you take up elements of framing, learn framing better, and then implement it in your speech, and you focus on it more than anything else. Sacrifice rebuttals if needed. You do not have that luxury. You cannot do that in a majors. You cannot experiment in a majors. So if you want to make something better, prioritize that, do that. If you're struggling with direct rebuttals, then deprioritize other elements of your speech, focus on direct rebuttals. Maybe don't do much of the other parts of your speech, right? Focus mostly on direct rebuttals and see how it goes and see how you can do it. So experiment a lot, and especially try to rectify your flaws as much as you can in practice. And that is the most important thing that I'll say here. So this is something that is the most important thing according to me here, which is experiment a lot in practice, especially in run up to majors. I think it's very, very important. So hopefully that was that in terms of owning your debate skills. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, raise hand, or put it in the chat. I'll be happy to answer. Now going on to the next part, which is gathering knowledge on different issues. Now, this is something that like a lot of people ask me about. I have certain set things that I'll say, but I want to clarify something, which is this has no specific like clear answer. I can give you an answer based on my experience, based on things that have worked for me, but like generally there is probably no right answer to this question as to how you gather knowledge for different issues. Oftentimes you can gather knowledge from in different ways. Sometimes there are unconventional ways in which you can gather knowledge in these things. So like there are different ways in which you can gather knowledge, but I'll tell you the ways in which I gathered knowledge and what has worked for me. So generally, even though later on in my debate career, I shifted to videos more, I also did a lot of reading. I used to do a lot of reading before when I was first going to majors and a lot of these things. But like generally speaking, I think videos also work as well, depending on which one you prefer as a format, right? So generally speaking, whichever one you prefer as a format is going to be something that is something that you can use, right? Sorry, just give me a second. Sorry, I had to sneeze. So as I was saying, with regards to like reading and videos, I think in cases of reading, you'll probably like know a lot of the things that are here in this slide: The Economist, Financial Times, The Guardian, I guess. In terms of focus media, Vox, Everyday Feminism, Pink News, The Root, Aeon. Everyday Feminism is a feminist website. Pink News covers LGBTQ issues. The Root covers Black issues in America. Aeon covers philosophy issues. So like there are focus media, there's mainstream media that covers all the topics. There's focus media that covers specific topics. Vox is a bit more sort of like, focused on America and sort of issues that pertain to America, sometimes like the foreign policy of America. But also they try to be international at times. But I guess Vox can be mainstream and focused both. But like generally, I guess as long as you have access to them, that's fine. The third thing I think is very important, which is read books on issues that you're least comfortable with. So oftentimes I see debaters coming to me and saying, "Oh, I'm not good at IR." If you're not good at IR, then read IR books. If you're not good at development or economics, read economics books. For example, one of the books that I generally recommend is Why Countries Fail by Acemoglu and Robinson. It's one of the books that I really recommend for people wanting to learn about development economics and how that interacts with developing countries, but also countries in generally in terms of like understanding political institutions, economic institutions. I think that is a great book to read more generally. Again, like read books on issues you are least comfortable with, and you will figure it out by yourself. Like there are books on crime. I think Dostoevsky has a book on crime. Generally, if you're not like used to, or you're not great at criminal justice debates, for example. So again, just like, read books on issues that you're least comfortable with. That's something that I recommend. Now, videos are something that I really, really like because you can sort of increase the speed. You can watch it twice. You can watch it once. It's sort of like the audio visual experience is better for me in terms of remembering things. That's why I follow like The Economist. Visual Politic N is a very underrated sort of channel that I would recommend. And another one of them is Economics Explained, which is again a great channel to follow. Polymatter. This is not an exhaustive list, of course, but these are the 5 channels that I follow the most to learn about debating, to gather knowledge about debating. Visual Politic N is great in terms of the way in which it does profile on specific issues in specific countries. It has issues on, it has like profiles on lots of countries, especially in Europe. Like if you have a Worlds in Europe, for example, which obviously is this year, then you can see that Visual Politic N has a playlist or a video on that particular country where Worlds is being hosted. And like in the history of Worlds, we've always seen that like the host country, there was 1 or 2 topics about the host country. Even in this Worlds, we had like topics about Serbia, for example. So like that's quite useful to have. Economics Explained is good for economics issues, especially because a lot of debaters struggle with economics sometimes. Vox, I said it already, it's good for like American issues and like covering American issues. Polymatter is actually very good for Asian issues more generally, given that Asian majors obviously is a huge part of what you do. I think that's also quite important here. So like in terms of like gathering knowledge on different issues, like you can do it, like you don't have to go through all of them. Like lots of options in this particular slide. These are all options. I want you to know that these options exist so that you can create a mix for yourself, and you can you can add and subtract different YouTube channels from this list. And that's fine as well. As I said, there's no straight answer. Do what works for you. I think that's quite important. Okay, now to a particularly fun part, more generally, preparing a matter bank. I think, sorry, just give me a second. Yeah, okay, so preparing a matter bank, right? So the way in which I recommend preparing a matter bank is through 2 separate sections, which is the stock arguments and 2 is recent issues. Sometimes you can also have historic issues in the matter bank as well, and I'll write this down because this is something that is a plausible, like I guess, 3rd section, historical issues, where obviously you can have things like World War II or like civil rights, women's rights, waves of feminism, etc. Like there are lots of things you can cover in historical issues, but I think these 2 sections are very important, with stock arguments and recent issues, right? Now, what I generally see when people try to prepare matter banks is they have a matter bank on recent issues. They often overlook the stock arguments part, which is not very helpful. And the reasoning behind it is like, I'll tell you what, 60 to 70%, maybe even more sometimes. I don't know. This is very rough estimate. It's not according to statistics, right? It's just based on my my sort of, I guess, experience on debating, 60 to 70% of debates oftentimes boil down to stock arguments, which obviously has to be adapted to the context. But I think you generally still need stock arguments such as, for example, monopolies in economics debate, which based on like which has a set pattern of how the argument is going to be run. Monopoly is bad. Here are reasons why monopoly is bad. Here are ways in which you can counteract the worst harms of monopoly. Here's ways in which monopolies can also be good in particular times, and you can divide it into segments. But essentially, like, stock arguments have a huge role to play in your prep for majors. And I would recommend that you divide them by themes and figure it out yourself to a certain extent. You see which arguments are being run in different sort of topics and sort of across different topics. So for example, you see one argument in international relations being repeated is the impact of sanctions, for example. What are the impact of sanctions? What the good impact of sanctions? What the bad impact of sanctions, for example, when it comes to criminal justice system? Why is rehabilitation important? How does rehabilitation work? How does retribution work? And why is retribution important? What is the characterization of victims? There are so many things that you can put into in terms of the stock argument section, like lots and lots of arguments that you can put in. The good thing about preparing for stock arguments is if you're still starting your debate career or you're midway through your debate career, right? If you've formed a stock argument sort of logbook, you can use it forever. Like if you've put in a lot of effort to prepare a stock argument book, you can use it forever. Maybe get people in your debating society to compile on a matter bank. I think that's a great idea. Usually when it comes to like coaching in WSDC, for example, we ask all 5 debaters and the coaches to work on the matter file together or the matter bank together. The one important part of this is stock arguments, and I want you to make sure that stock arguments are done with like putting in enough amount of effort in it. And I think that's quite important in terms of like, dividing it by themes and sort of like then generating common arguments. The thing that I want to focus on here is you need to focus on mechanistic analysis. What do I mean by mechanistic analysis? Oftentimes when it comes to certain things, like if you have mechanistic analysis noted down for that particular argument, then you have like a huge leg up in a lot of debates. Let me give you an example. So one of the arguments that oftentimes is used is states have an incentive to do good for people. And then you can have lots of reasons why states have an incentive to do good for people, like democratic incentive, media accountability, the fact that state wants to keep in power, the fact that state wants to avoid unrest through protests, and a lot of other things. So like when you list down a lot of these mechanistic analysis, you can just copy paste and use them in like a particular debate or like lots of debates going forward. And I think the flip also applies, like states can be bad for citizens. And here are ways in which states can be bad for citizens. So for example, campaign financing, lobbying, in which interest groups, special interest groups use the state, perverse incentive of politicians to be short-termist instead of long-termist because of election cycles, etc. So like, again, lots of mechanistic analysis can be there for why states are good for citizens and states are bad for citizens. But if you have it all noted down in a matter file in the stock arguments list, then it's great, right? Then it's something that already gives you a leg up in a lot of debates which involve states, where you have to characterize states as good or you have to characterize states as bad. So for example, if you look at like I think this was 2019 World's Bubble Room, which is round 9 motion, which was that this house believes that this house would privatize utilities in developing countries. I think the characterization of state would matter for like a huge part of the debate. There, if you had a matter bank where you could just go like, oh, this is what states do, and just list a lot of the analysis with regards to states, you have a huge advantage in that debate. And like these are things like that often. So oftentimes you'll see that round 8, round 9, or like round 8 of UADC, round 9 of Worlds, round 8 of Ostros are rounds where you have very safe motions where often a lot of stock arguments come into play. In those cases, if you have a good stock argument notebook or a huge sort of comprehensive section of stock arguments in your matter file, then you can use them, and then you can think of secondary things, right? Okay, what are the things that apply contextually to this debate? What are the things that are important in the context of this debate, and a lot of other things. So I think that is quite useful in this particular instance, right? So stock arguments, make a section out of it. I can't stress on how important this is. Secondly, in terms of recent issues, if possible, write it from the perspective of 2 or more sides. The reason I say this is oftentimes you'll see that like any issue has 2 sides, and you want to write from 2 sides because that's when like the debate happens. So for example, like in the Russia-Ukraine war, there's a side that says that the West should be more involved in the war and intervene more in the war, not like intervene militarily, but like, more harsher sanctions, for example, or more military aid. There are groups that say that no, West shouldn't be that involved in the war because that sort of risks an escalation between Russia and the West, which can risk like World War III, for example, right? So like, you need to write it from both perspectives and arguments from both perspectives. There are lots of scholars, there are lots of like people who write it in the column section. So for example, like this is one media that I haven't recommended for a while because I haven't checked it out in recent times, but I can tell you that I used to do it 2-3 years ago, which is Project Syndicate, where in Project Syndicate there are lots of commentators like academicians, people who have researched on this a lot, who provide their commentary on that particular issue. If you can find 2 or more perspectives on a particular issue, note those recent issues down on the basis of those 2 or more perspectives, because that's when like you're likely to get topics where you can use these 2 perspectives and you sort of can use this perspective in constructing your case, constructing your arguments, in a lot of cases, constructing your framing, for example. Sometimes if you are a bit lazy, you are crammed for time, copy paste articles if needed, because the point of a matter bank is you print it, right? And now that we're going back to debating offline, but also even in online majors, it's not allowed to Google things, right? You need to also, even if you could Google things, let's say hypothetically you could, you shouldn't, even though I know that a lot of people do end up doing this, which is wrong, and if they get caught, they'll be thrown out of the major. It's still not worth it to do it, because if you have a matter bank where you can be like, oh, I know everything that's in the matter bank, you can just search it very fast. A Google search is very open-ended. You don't know what you're talking, you don't know what you want. And specifically when it comes to debate motions are very specific, right? If you compile a matter bank, it will also mean by default, hopefully, that you have at least read it once. Then you can just refer back to it and be like, you know what, this was in the matter bank. Okay, page 47. Let's look through this. So in those instances, if you are crammed for time, you can copy paste articles if needed from like, from like different sources like The Economist, Financial Times, etc. But at least compile it in a matter bank, because I think that's very important, especially when you're getting back to offline majors. You can just print it and then you can follow it from there. Note down possible arguments in those issues. I think that's quite important when it comes to these things. Like note down possible arguments in those issues as much as you can, as much as you're able to. I think that also helps in like forming your sort of understanding of these issues, like whether it be Russia, Ukraine, whether it be the issues related to Venezuela, whether it be the issues related to North Korea. Like there are so many ways in which you can look at it, right? There are like issues with regards to like, like bailout from IMF in Sri Lanka or Pakistan. There's so many issues that are happening in the world at a particular point in time. Note down possible arguments in those issues. Like, for example, what are the arguments for Sri Lanka taking a loan from the IMF? What are the arguments against Sri Lanka taking a loan from the IMF? So like, that's just, again, one example where you can sort of note it down in a matter bank, and that's how you can construct the matter bank. The third section, as I said, I wrote it later on, which is the historical issues. Now, this is something that you probably need to do once at best. You need to use your best judgment as to how you want to use it. Like in terms of historical issues, there are some historical issues that are usually in majors. So for example, like you'll see World War II as a context in the ESL final of Worlds this year, which again shows you that like, these things aren't out of debating completely. You can like, you can note down World War II, you can note down civil rights, women's rights, the different waves of feminism and how they came about, like the right to vote for women. There are so many issues that you can cover. I would say deprioritize it when compared to like these 2 things, which is stock arguments and recent issues. But I'd still say that it's still important enough to be included. If you have the time after doing these 2 things, do have some historical issues that you see generally in terms of trends of like, debating in generally. So that's how you sort of prepare a matter bank. Hopefully that's clear. So anticipating motions, I guess this is a special part where like a lot of people, I know for a fact most people don't do this. So hopefully maybe if you're attending this and you do it, great for you. But I know for a fact most people don't do it. How do you anticipate motions? The first thing that you do in terms of anticipating motions is assume you are an ACHCOR member. This part of preparation, if you're doing practice, if you're doing self-practice, if you're preparing a matter bank, what you need to do is you need to assume that you are an ACHCOR member. You're reading articles from different sources. Assume that you're an ACHCOR member. What would you do if you're an ACHCOR of UADC? What would you do if you're an ACHCOR of ABP? What would you do if you're an ACHCOR of Worlds? What topics would you set, right? There's so many things happening in the world at the moment. What would you take and what would be like, okay, this is the topic that I would set. This is something that I like in this particular instance. This is something that I'd like to set in this particular case. what is that topic? Do you think these topics have like, when you set the topics, do you think these topics have A, balance, and B, depth? And while testing for balance and depth, you'll figure out the arguments in the topic, because in order to test balance, you need to be like, oh, this is the argument in cup, this is the argument in op. None of these arguments are a silver bullet, which means that there are responses to these arguments, and these are the responses, and these arguments can be well constructed. So this particular topic is balanced. Does it have depth? Obviously, depth is a less important question in 3v3 majors like UADC and Ostros. I think it's still important, because like oftentimes, like if it's a 3v3 debate, if there are only one argument in one side and one argument in the other side, oftentimes it gets very difficult for the debate to evolve. So I think like understanding depth in even 3v3 context is important. So do you think these topics have balance, and do you think these topics have depth? If you think they do and you can establish that, I think that's great in terms of practice, in terms of like assuming that you are an ACHCORE member. What this would help in, generally, what this would do is, this would help you anticipate motions. And here, I think one other thing that you can do is look into the track record of the majors ACHCOREs. Here, look at what kind of motion topics they like to set. So you'll see that like there are some ACHCORE members that really like to set like one econs or finance heavy motions. There are one ACHCORE member that like to set IR motions. Like look into it. Look into the track records of major ACHCOREs. Like for example, like if you have like if you're looking for like Belgrade Worlds, for example, what kind of motions does Milos set? What kind of motions does Enting set? What kind of motions does Rob Berry set? Like there are so many ACHCORE members. Obviously, try to look at like all of them and see what kind of track record do they have in setting motions, what kind of topics they like. This will help you anticipate motions in the final. So for example, like in case when we were preparing for Worlds, we did anticipate there would be a motion from Serbia, because there was obviously a Serbian ACHCORE member, but the world was set in, not world, but Worlds like organizer was also Belgrade. So like if you are an ACHCORE member, then you would probably set a motion about Serbia. And there were a couple of motions about Serbia, for example, in Worlds that year. I think we prepped that there would be a motion about Cambridge Analytica at some point, even though Cambridge Analytica did not really appear in that Worlds. Guess where Cambridge Analytica was? It was in Worlds Open Quarters in Belgrade. It wasn't exactly Cambridge Analytica, but if you look at the motion where you're banning like banning the usage of like sophisticated algorithms or something like that, I think data analytics in politics or something like that, or elections or something like that, which is basically Cambridge Analytica, right? That's a Cambridge Analytica motion, for example. So when the Cambridge Analytica documentary came out in Netflix, I was like, you know what? I need to watch this documentary. I need to read as much as on this, because there may be a motion. And even though I didn't get it for a while, I got it this Worlds. So like that's when like I was assuming that I was an ACHCORE member. I was assuming, okay, this is a debate that can happen. This is a debate that, that I can set from this particular piece of material. So you can assume that you are an ACHCORE member. And oftentimes you'll be like, but you know what? I'm still not as good to assume that I'm an ACHCORE member. Doesn't matter. Like it actually literally does not matter. Like ACHCORE members are not like some like great, like obviously they're great debaters, but they are not so far away from you that you will never be in that level. Like when I started off debating, I got like in my first ABP, I got like 9 points, right? Which is like out of 11 in 6 rounds, which is a very bad track record. And I used to look at ACHCORE members and be like, oh, these people are amazing, great debaters. Yes, but what I wrongly assume is that I can never be in that level. And that's what I used to think to a certain extent, which is would absolutely be in their level like 4 or 5 years down the line. And like in those instances, at that point in time, maybe if I had a bit more confidence in myself and assuming I can become like them, but before that, I need to step into their shoes and try to think from their perspective what they want to set in that particular majors, because then my prep for majors will be much better going forward. And this realization came to me a lot later. I want you to have that realization a lot earlier. So don't assume that like being an ACHCORE is so out of reach that you cannot assume to be an ACHCORE member. The second part obviously is like when you assume to be an ACHCORE member and you look like, well, this is the motion I can set on this issue, this is the motion that I can set on this issue, you try to incorporate it into the matter bank, and you turn the contentious issues into sections of the matter bank and have practice debates on the issues to become comfortable in them. So if you have a debate about like, Russia, Ukraine, and you think, okay, maybe this is a debate that I would like to have on the Russia, Ukraine issue, have that debate in a practice session. It doesn't matter if the motion is imbalanced. It doesn't matter if anything, but at least you have a good discussion on it. At least you're more comfortable now having a discussion or having a debate on that particular issue. At least you are now more familiar with the arguments that are there. So even if like that motion is a bit off, still have that debate, right? Still have that practice. I think it's very important to do so in that particular instance. That generally helps when in practicing for majors. So anticipating motions is a huge part of practicing for majors, and I want you guys to give utmost importance to this. All right, now the last section, which is the cheat sheet. Now, this is a bit of a new thing that I guess maybe it's not absolutely new. I'm guessing people have used cheat sheets before, but cheat sheets are different from matter files, and I'll explain how. I'll probably give you the link of like one of the cheat sheets that I've used in recent times. The role of the cheat sheet is to act as a reminder of doing things. So for example, sometimes you'll see that there are debaters who sometimes forget to do weighing. For example, they'll do direct rebuttals, and they'll do so many direct rebuttals that they'll end their speech with only direct rebuttals. They say your whip in UADC, right? Obviously, whip in UADC, direct rebuttals are a huge part. Doesn't mean that you don't do weighing. Doesn't mean that you don't do even ifs. Doesn't mean that you don't do best case, worst case comparisons, right? So in those cases, it's important for you to have something that reminds you of doing things that oftentimes you forget. So keep things in the cheat sheet that you usually forget. So for example, oftentimes you'll forget to flag post. Oftentimes you'll forget to do mechanistic analysis, and that is something that is important, right? Oftentimes you'll forget that this is the structure of the argument, and I should follow the structure of the argument. There are so many things that like you may forget. Generally have those things. So for example, there are a list of 5 questions that you think you should follow in prep. If that is true, put it in the cheat sheet, put it in like 1 or 2 pages, within 1 or 2 pages, put it in that cheat sheet, and make sure that it acts as a reminder of that throughout the particular debate, because it's in that cheat sheet, right? So have prep-based and role-based sections if possible, so that it can act as a reminder of doing things. Generally, oftentimes you'll find these strategy sessions online in the European debating platform and like other debating platform. I think there's one great playlist from the Auckland Society as well. There are so many like playlists online. You'll see like what to do in prep. There's an Ashish Kumar session on like how to win from OG, for example. What do you do in OG? I guess it can apply to like government or proposition in 3v3 debating as well. But when you list down those things, make sure that you like have those things list down so that you can follow them going forward. So when the role of the cheat sheet is to act as a reminder, act as a checklist for you to do things. So when you're preparing the cheat sheet, divide it into different strategy sections, understand your debating better, and fill it with things you need as a reminder as a debater, and imagine making a checklist. So what I'll do here is I'll actually share with you the cheat sheet that I've used recently. And I'll provide a link to this in the chat. Hopefully the link to this will be there given that it's being recorded. Hopefully it'll be when it's posted online as well. But I'll give you the link here. Here's the link, and I'll share it with you as well. So if you look at this, it has construction strategies, it has impacting strategies, it has rebuttal strategies, and it has framing strategies, right? So you will see that it has a lot of things. It starts from generalist things to more sort of specific things. So for example, vulnerability is a impacting strategy that is more generally. Numbers or mass effect is an impacting strategy that's more general, right? There are more sort of specific economic effects, political effects, criminal justice, increasing happiness, which is again a form of impacting. For example, you just have a list of these things just as a reminder of these things. You have construction strategies where you have incentives, trend analysis, context-based, structure-based, like for example, welfare states generally act in certain ways, democratic states act in certain ways, and stuff, right? So monetary motivation, religious reasons, maximizing happiness, building social and political capital, security reasons. So how you construct arguments, you can use these strategies. Rebuttal strategies, cohort benefits through mechanisms on our side and show why the benefits is greater or more likely. This is untrue. This is a rebuttal strategy. This is unlikely. It's also a rebuttal strategy. we have a competing claim. In comparison, our claim is more likely. That is also a rebuttal strategy. This is unimportant. This is less important than our claim. This is less important than they claim. It is mitigation, mostly based on existing ways in which same impact can be reached. These are all like rebuttal strategies. This I think is a great list of rebuttal strategies, to be fair. I think it's pretty comprehensive. There are also like framing strategies, reducing, fulfilling burdens, reducing our burden, increasing their burden, explaining why they do not fulfill their burden. Burden pushes to make it explicit on what they're proving and then later follow it up. The content is not mutually exclusive, coupled with some mitigation as well. I guess oftentimes mutual exclusivity can be used as a mitigation strategy. The content is not relevant. So like there are lots of framing strategies as well. I think the second section is actually better than the first one. The first one is actually very difficult to have a comprehensive note of because construction and impacting can be so varied depending on the context of the debate and depending on the motion. But rebuttals and framing has, I guess, a more sort of exhaustive list, so to speak. So you can have a more exhaustive list here. So hopefully this will help more generally. If you want to, I would not, I like, if you want to use this, feel free to go ahead, just print this, have it, use it. As you can see, it's very small. It's just one sheet of material. But if you want to form your own, feel free to do so. I think that will be better depending on what your debating sort of has and what your debating can sort of needs and what your debating can accommodate for. I think it's better to have a cheat sheet that is more sort of geared towards your debating than anything else. So if you have additional stuff, maybe you can have this as a general thing, and maybe what is more important for you, you can list it down here later. So for example, like you can also add like questions to ask during prep time here. Okay, I won't write it here because this has already been shared. But for example, right, you can write questions that you ask during prep time, share and then list it down, and maybe you can extend it to 2 pages. It's fine if it's 2 pages, but the whole point of keeping it very short in 1 to 2 pages is just you can just have a look at it during prep time, right? Because in prep time, like 15 minutes or 30 minutes, whatever you have, it's not a lot of prep time. You cannot look at a lot of things. So even when you're like preparing rebuttals, when you're like, how do I prepare rebuttals to this? You just look at this and be like, oh, there are 8 strategies. Okay, I can use one of them to rebut. Which one of them applies? Then you can apply whichever one that applies there. You can use it during debates. You can use it during prep and all of that. So I guess since I've provided a link to this, just download it. You just go to file, download it, Word, PDF, whatever you want, edit it, make sure that it caters to your debating, make it more specific, do whatever you can and whatever you want. Yeah, hopefully this will help with that. So yeah, that's like the cheat sheet more generally. So yeah, those were like the 5 sections, and yeah, this is not that big of a workshop. I wanted to keep it as crisp and as crystallized as possible because, as I said, I have said a lot of things, and a lot of these things, implementing a lot of these things require a lot of effort, and I understand that. Even if you streamline your effort, make sure that you address your weaknesses first. So for example, if you have a limited amount of time to prepare, like cater a lot of these things that I've like said here to mitigate those weaknesses that you have, to make sure that you do not have many weaknesses. At the end of the day, it's impossible to give a perfect speech in 7 minutes. It's impossible to give a perfect speech in 8 minutes, right? However, it is possible to reduce as many mistakes as you can within those 7 minutes or within those 8 minutes. And that should be the philosophy of your debating. Reduce as many mistakes as you can so that you don't leave it to the judge to decide whether or not you won the debate. You'd win it so comprehensively that the judge has no other way but to give you the debate. I think that's the best way. That's the mentality that you should have when preparing for majors. You don't leave it to chance. You leave it to the amount of effort that you've put in majors. Oftentimes you'll see you get frustrated losing close debates. Oftentimes you'll see judges giving the debate the other way when you thought you would win this debate. In those instances, remember that your prep and the way in which you prepare should address these things. As I said, you should win the debate so comprehensively that the judge has no other way but to give it to you. And that's what your motto should be. That's what your inspiration should be while preparing for majors. So yeah, that was it from my side. I guess if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'll be here for a few more minutes. And then I guess we can end the lecture. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the chat or just raise your hand and I'll ask you to unmute you. That's fine as well. Well, if there are no questions, hopefully that means that you've understood everything. Hopefully this means that everything was there. I guess if this is recorded and it's in YouTube, then feel free to post questions in the comment section. Hopefully I can check it every once or twice. How do you prepare for second and third speeches at home? That's actually a very good question. Okay, so this is something that I probably forgot to say at that point in time, because obviously I said PM and LO speeches. The first thing to note here is that the PM and LO speeches preparation is for all speakers, right? It's not just for first speakers, or it's not just for second speakers, it's not just for third speakers, it's all for all speakers. Even if you're a third speaker, you do PM and LO speeches as practice, because what it does is it reflects the PM and LO speech is a better reflection, is more of a reflection of prep time. So I think when preparing for cases, or generally when you're going through that prep time, what the PM or LO speeches help you to do is construct better cases. Most debates, and trust me when I say this, most debates are won or lost in prep time. So when you're preparing PM and LO speeches, make sure that you do prepare PM and LO speeches as like a reflection of your prep time. And once you start constructing better cases, it helps you construct better cases. So the PM and LO speech practice, the self-practice part, wasn't for first speaker practice. Obviously, it can act as first speaker practice, but mostly it was for case preparation and case construction practice. So make sure that you treat it as such, and make sure that you prepare first speeches in that way. Now, in terms of preparing for second and third speeches, sadly, there aren't many ways you can do it. Obviously, one way is like you can play a video where you're like, okay, first speech, I assume that this person is my teammate. And second speech is like the LO, and then the third speech, which is the PPM speech, I give it. Obviously, you can do that. But I think the best way of preparing specifically for second and third speeches would be have to be practice with other people. Sadly, it's something that's difficult to do in terms of self-practice. For self-practice, I would just recommend doing PM and LO as a better strategy for a case preparation. If you want to do like ladder speakers mode, then I think do the LO mode, because LO has at least rebuttal and framing elements. Obviously, like PM speech also has very heavy framing elements, but LO speech framing elements and LO speech rebuttal elements are more similar to second and third speeches than the PM speech is. And that would help you. So for second and third speakers, I guess prep the LO one more. And when you do like within practices within your community, then you can practice second and third speeches. Okay. On a more, hopefully that answers your question. On a more mental preparation note, how do you deal with thinking that you're wasting time preparing for a major, especially if you've come from an institution that hasn't been historically successful? Well, I think the best way I can answer this is inspiration, I guess. Like before us, no team from Asia had won worlds. So like going into our fourth world, Sajid and I, we had already broken like very high up at worlds. We had already done open quarterfinals. Like we were like, well, is it even possible to win worlds from Asia or something like that? Obviously, like, yes, we have still had the privilege of doing well at worlds. I'm obviously not going to lie the fact that we had also been for the large part of our debate career from IBADU, which had, by the time we had entered into IBADU, it had already done Asian finals. It had already broken open at worlds as the first Bangladeshi team, for example. So I won't pretend like I know a lot about like coming from an institution that hasn't been historically successful. But I guess it's a relative thing where you also recognize that when we were debating, we hadn't seen an Asian team in finals when we started doing worlds. We hadn't seen an Asian team in the final of worlds the last 10, 12 years. So that was still like a daunting thing. What I would say is that it's not time wasting, especially when like a lot of majors have already adopted the whole form about like institutional codes. Like you don't have institution names anymore. Like when you go to worlds, it's not Oxford or Cambridge anymore. It's just this random, just fully random, right? In those cases, I think given that the debating world generally is also becoming more accommodating, it's becoming more accommodating towards English as a second language speakers, English as foreign language speakers. It's more becoming more accommodating towards institutions that have not had a lot of success in the past with like, using name codes instead of like institutional names. I think in that world, I think it's worth it to make that, like, take that step, make that like risk. Like last year in Worlds, it was the first ESL team to ever to win Worlds, and we were the second ESL team ever to win Worlds, right? Like before that, ESL teams, what we could have thought, like we could have thought like going to semis was our ceiling, going to finals was our ceiling, winning was something that was so alien to us for ESL teams, for example, right? So what I would say is that a lot of these barriers have been broken in debating and will keep breaking, and hopefully institutional barriers as well. If you think there's a barrier for your institutions, hopefully you'll be able to break it with given the enough amount of effort that you put in, given the amount of practice and the amount of skill that you can build through debating, and you can sharpen your skills better. So in those cases, I think it's very possible to break them, and hopefully it won't be a waste of time. And even if worst case, okay, you don't get success, right? Even a lot of the prep when it comes to debating will help you later on in life, whether it be job interviews, whether it be the ability to speak publicly better, ability to present better, and a lot of other things. So regardless of like, amount of debating effort that you put in, it's still not worth less. It's still worth something, right? How do you ensure the feedback that you give yourself from self-practice can be as efficient as giving from a first-person perspective or a coach too? As I said, like, obviously it probably won't be as good as getting it from someone who is a very good coach, for example. It's just not possible to do so. However, as I said, you as a person thinking about a debate for half a day versus you as a person who's thinking about a debate for like 10 minutes, the person who's like you thinking about the particular topic for half a day is a better debater, and you get feedback from that debater, and that's how you channel in like skills from you yourself to another version of yourself. It's a bit meta, I guess. I hope I'm making sense, but that still makes sure that you can provide good feedback. Sometimes you can take the help of your teammate. Sometimes you can make your teammate listen to it. Sometimes you can have a discussion with the teammate on this particular case. Oh, what do you think the case is? And oh, this is something that I thought. Oh, okay, this is something that you thought. This is something different. Maybe I could have thought it in this particular way or something like that. So like there are different ways in which, but I think generally self-prep is still very efficient. Self-prep is still very good because, as I said, it allows a better version of yourself to give feedback to a worse version of yourself. And that's how you sort of, make yourselves better slowly. And that's how you do that. Should my better material bank focus on topics that I generally lack in, or should it focus on all the matters universally, assuming that I only have limited time? If you have limited time, focus more on the topics that you are weak at, and then move on to other topics if you have the time. So because obviously prioritization is more important. So like your matter bank should focus on topics that you are weak at, and then move on to other stuff. Yeah, that would be my answer. All right, cool. I think that seems to be like the end of the questions. Thank you guys for having me. Thank you MIDP for organizing this. Thank you to the UADC Orcom, ACHCOR for inviting me to take this session. Hopefully this was helpful from the perspective of, I guess, an Asian debater trying to navigate through the four majors. So yeah, hopefully this helps, and hopefully you can carry forward, and hopefully you can just keep prepping and make your prep much better, streamline your prep, and sort of prepare yourself better for majors, I guess, just generally. So hopefully this was helpful. Yeah, as you can see, I'm wearing a Mercedes shirt, so there's a race today. Best of luck to George and Lewis for the race. But yeah, thank you for the session. And I guess hopefully I'll see you at some point. Majors are coming back offline. AVP is happening offline, hopefully the next year. So I'll see you guys at some point, hopefully, if you're around in the debate circuit. Feel free to approach me if you have a question, like in debate circuit, I guess, the Asian debate circuit. I'm actually looking forward really to come back to Asian majors. I really feel at home when I'm at an Asian major, and it sort of feels very empty inside, I guess, that I haven't been to an in-person Asian majors in a while. So really looking forward to it. So yeah, thank you guys for having me. Best of luck for the majors, and best of luck for UADC.
Thank you, Sourodip, for making the time, and thank you everyone for joining this workshop. So we can call it a day, and have a great rest of the day, everyone.
Bye-bye.